Good morning, good evening, and good day. Today we're going to be talking about what are the 3 things that you can do to get started with open source. And I will tell you up front, the 3 things are going to be exploring, connecting, and contributing. So let's get into it. So first off, we're going to talk about exploration. When you're looking at open source projects, really you want to find your niche. And what I mean by that is if you're a front-end developer, maybe there's a new and exciting framework that you want to take a look at. If you're an SRE or DevOps engineer, maybe there's some automation tools that you use at your work that you're thinking, maybe I could extend this in some way. I think the most important part is to choose a project that solves a problem that you have. And that way, you're actually going to be using the thing that you're contributing to, which I think is super important. You know, it's kind of that feedback loop, or what they call it, the term they use in the industry is dog fooding. So you're eating the thing that you're creating.
So here's what the GitHub homepage looks like. And when you're exploring for different projects, this is a good place to start. Here you'll find like a feed of people that you follow. Oftentimes I find projects just by looking at what other people are looking at. So like this is a guy that works in GitOps and progressive delivery. Here's another guy from VMware, and then some other people that I follow as well from school and others. But here's where we're mainly going to focus. On the right is this Explore page, and we're just going to click on Explore More. And it actually has a personalized page for you based on things that you have liked. So if you're not already starring repositories, I highly recommend just like starring Git repositories as you're browsing, and that'll help better curate this page for you. You can see all these different projects that GitHub is suggesting to me as things that are interesting. All of them are Kubernetes, really, no surprise there. And then there's also trending developers and trending repositories. I find those to be pretty interesting because that kind of helps me see outside of the little bubble of my own area of expertise. So this is a really easy and useful way you can kind of find projects that you might find interesting to contribute to.
Next up, we have connecting. So this is actually not necessarily a technical part of open source, but it is a skill that's a soft skill, and it's more about being communicative, being open, and actually getting to know relationally the maintainers of the project. So, for example, there are lots of ways to connect with the community of certain sets of open source tools, and I'll just use Kubernetes as an example since that's the one I'm most familiar with. You can connect with the community via Slack channels. Is probably the easiest way to do that. And there are different channels that are specific to different parts of that ecosystem, depending on how mature the product is or the project. Sometimes it's just a single maintainer, a single set of functions, and there's not necessarily a need to have specialized groups. But for a lot of larger projects, you'll see SIGs, or special interest groups. And for those, they are subcomponents of a project, and they often go into depth or have their own sort of sub-community within that tool. And that can help you even further get connected on a more personal basis with some of the core maintainers of that part of the ecosystem. Also, there are meetups for different sets of tools. So for instance, you can attend virtual meetups. Prior to shelter in place, there were a lot of meetups done through meetup.com. So you could actually go in person and visit people that are also using that set of tooling or are contributing in a way that's pushing the needle further. And I would say that this is a really awesome way to actually build your network. So if you're able to, I would definitely recommend attending meetups, whether virtual or in person, and just getting the names, associating faces with usernames. I know at KubeCon, although I've never been, from what I've heard from friends in the community, that becomes like their one point of contact a year for a lot of people to see in person this username that they've, communicated with day in and day out over the rest of the year. So I think that's a really cool way to connect and engage. Another way you can do that is by reading, responding, and opening issues on GitHub. So GitHub becomes kind of this forum in a sense, because through issues, you're able to raise concerns, to give feedback, and you don't necessarily need to be the one to open an issue. You can also just go and comment, share your own knowledge about your experience with that particular issue, bug, or feature enhancement. And finally, at this point, we can talk about contribution. And if you've done the first two things, it's likely that you're already doing the last, which is contributing. And a lot of people think that contribution only takes the form of pull requests and code and feature enhancements. But I'm here to tell you that that's not necessarily true. You can contribute in other ways. I think submitting pull requests is one of them, but also being an advocate for the tool, answering questions, providing feedback, those are all ways that you can contribute, and that is also impacting the project and your tool positively. So definitely do those things. I will say if you want to, gain recognition within that ecosystem, writing code is something that you're definitely going to have to do. And it looks different for different projects, but one thing that you'll find in most open source repositories is a document, and it's called contributing.markdown, and it's rather self-explanatory. It's kind of like a README, except the target audience are developers. So it'll have steps for like how to set up a build environment locally, how to open a pull request. For some repositories, they might ask you to send a agreement, basically saying that like I consent to this being part of this license agreement, and that it's open and free for use. And I would say just check with your employer if you're doing this on work hours, or if you're associating it with your work email, so that way they're aware that you're contributing code that's not IP for your employer. And this is really important because a lot of employers will state that anything that you create during work hours with any work material is considered intellectual property of your employer. So just be cognizant of this when you're contributing to open source, and know that for that reason, a lot of projects will ask you to sign an agreement. So those are my 3 tips for how to get started in the open source world. So just to recap, we talked about exploring, which can look like literally scrolling the GitHub explore page. But the main purpose of this step is to find something that you're interested in. And secondly, we talked about connecting, which involves actually communicating with the human beings behind the project, getting to know them, and familiarizing yourself with the documentation. And lastly, we touched on contributing, which means that you're giving back to the project. And I think this is super important, and it extends beyond just like the technical aspects of contributing. I think it has a lot to do with like our own like sense of duty, like how often are we just consuming things without giving back in life and in technology. So I would really highlight this as an important aspect of being involved in a community of open source, which we all are, right? So I hope you found these things useful, and thanks. This has been the Millennial SRE. Catch you later.